Thank you for joining us for Gardening in the Mountains. My name is Allison Arnold. I'm the extension agent here in Buncombe County, and I'll be your host today. Welcome to Gardening in the Mountains, Planting Shrubs and Trees. Our speaker today is Luke Owen. Luke is the North Carolina Cooperative Extension commercial horticulture agent here in Buncombe County and currently works with local growers and green industry professionals. Luke grew up on a small family farm in Western North Carolina, selling plants with his grandparents at the local farmers market. He obtained his associate's degree in horticulture technology at Blue Ridge Community College, and then his undergraduate and master's degrees at the Horticultural Science Department at NC State. We're happy to have Luke here again today. Thank you, Luke, for Gardening in the Mountains, to help us learn the important best management practices at the time of planting to help shrubs and trees establish well and live a long and healthy life.
Thanks, Allison. Thanks, everyone, for attending another Gardening in the Mountains series. I hope you'll enjoy this talk on properly planting shrubs and trees. As Allison mentioned, I work a lot with green industry professionals and growers. When we're talking about proper planting practices, a lot of those practices are based on standards that landscape professionals use, which is based on the American Nursery Industry Standards, or ANSI. Based on plant selection considerations, site preparation, we're going to be talking about proper planting techniques, good plant establishment tips and tricks. We're going to start talking about the importance of selecting a good quality plant and tree so that we're starting off on the right foot. If you pick a tree of poor quality or one that's going to have some defects, there's some potential problems down the road, even if we plant that tree properly. It all starts at the store or nursery. One of the first things that you should look for in trees and shrubs is what we call the leader, or the central leader of the plant. In the case of trees, that's 1 leader typically that we're looking for. The leader of the plant is the topmost portion, or the apical bud of the plant. In selecting trees with a healthy leader, we're looking at trees that don't have codominant stems and want only 1 bud at the top of the tree. Trees that have dueling buds or codominants in the tops of their branching structure tend to struggle in terms of form down the road if we don't prune those other codominant leaders out. Some trees and shrubs are multi-leader, and we want them to have multiple stems, like your river birch or serviceberry. When you're selecting multi-leader plants, just look at those leader angles and make sure that there's no sharp angles. We typically say anything sharper than 45 degrees is at risk once that plant starts to grow and adds more caliper or leader width. The weight of that tree can oftentimes lead to it snapping later in life. So we're looking at branch angles, and if it's a central leader, selecting plants with that healthy leader. The second thing that we need to look at in terms of plant selection for trees and shrubs is the canopy or crown height. Deciduous and evergreen trees are somewhat similar. We want the foliage or most of the branching to start at 60% of that plant's height, meaning that you shouldn't have a lot of major branch structure below that 2/3 level. So you should have a stem up 2/3 of the tree, and then you should start seeing branching for your deciduous trees. Evergreen trees, a little bit higher, say 3/4 of the way. And that's going to minimize those pruning wounds, maintain a desirable tree shape, and lead to longevity of that plant's life. If you were to select a plant that had branches lower on the branching stem, that's going to lead to more pruning. That's an opportunity to introduce more diseases and ask for more problems down the road. The third thing that we should look at is the root ball. This is a critical step. The root ball should have no more than 2 to 3 inches of soil or media on top of that root zone. It ensures that the tree and shrub was planted properly at the nursery. You may even have to remove some of that soil at the time of planting But if it's planted too deep at the nursery, that's a red flag when I would select plants. Or if a nursery grower was going to accept a shipment of plants, one of the things they look at is making sure that those plants were planted or set in the pot or in the field at the proper depth. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. The last factor that you should look at is the trunk of the tree. We want to make sure that tree or shrub is centered in the pots and not damaged. Look for those marks, chips in the bark that could be defects that could lead to more wounding or rot down the road. We want to make sure that trunk is not loose in the pot or in the soil. As that tree enters the soil, we should see a natural flare at the bottom of that tree's environment, whether that be in a container or in the field. All right, we've talked about plant quality. Now I want to briefly touch on transporting and handling plants as you're getting to the site where you're going to plant those trees and shrubs. For your larger trees and shrubs, it's important to always lift with your legs and not your back. That's basic ergonomics. For those that aren't familiar with ball and burlap, that's going to be field dug plants that are going to have a wire cage or staples with the root ball covered in burlap. Those are going to be huge root systems typically attached to these plants, and they're going to be larger. If you do plant a larger tree and shrub that's ball and burlap, be sure that you're using equipment or you have multiple people there to help you and you're not hurting yourself when you're moving those plants. During transport, it's also critical to protect the canopies of these plants with tarps or burlap to prevent wind burn or damage in transport, especially if you're transporting in the back of an open bed vehicle. At the nursery, they'll oftentimes wrap trunks with plastic or paper to avoid damage in transit, or they'll tie the tops of those canopies together, adding some additional support and structure with all those lateral branches. They might tie a piece of twine around the tops of those plants to provide more security and prevent damage during transit. So all of those are things that you can do to protect that plant before you even get to your site. It's important to note that bud break, or that time physiologically in the plant's life where buds are starting to burst and come out, that's typically the most delicate time of that plant's life. So it's really at risk of wind or mechanical damage if you're transporting trees that's just starting to have leaf or bud break or flowers starting to develop. You need to be extra careful during that period of time. We've talked about always lifting the root ball or container safely, but importantly, you never want to lift a plant, whether that be field dug or at the container nursery, by holding the trunk. If you pick that plant up by the trunk, that can cause some root damage in the long run. So try not to do that. Try to lift it by the lip or the lid of that container or by the root ball itself. There's multiple tools that you can use to do that. If moving multiple plants at a time, stack them laterally or sideways on top of each other, the pots or root balls. That's going to prevent a lot of that damage from happening rather than standing plants up vertically. When we purchase a plant, when we get it from the nursery or our garden center, and we're about to plant it out in the landscape, oftentimes we might not have the ability to plant it right away as soon as we get back from the store. During that short time of holding that plant before you plant it, be sure that you're keeping that plant watered and protected from wind and direct sunlight. If that plant is not in the ground, that root tissue is exposed to conditions that it's ordinarily not exposed to, and that can lead to high levels of evapotranspiration in the roots as well as in the tree canopy itself. Never let your root balls freeze if you're planting your Bareroot plants or things that are in the dormant time of the year. You'll want to heal those plants in. You can see what that looks like in the picture at the bottom left in this ball and burlap nursery. That's just the top of the root ball that you're seeing. And they've healed in the bottom of those plants with mulch or organic leaf debris, something like that, to prevent that freezing damage from occurring in those root balls. That's something to definitely keep in mind. All right, so site preparation, now we're starting to get into the planting process and the things that we need to think about right before we plant. When we're preparing to plant a tree or shrub, or really any plant in the landscape, if it's possible, to prepare an entire planting bed at the same time with amendments. That's going to be ideal rather than just digging a hole and amending that hole at the time of planting. Research has shown that if we amend just the planting hole with organic matter, for example, or if we throw fertilizer only in the hole in which we're planting, that encourages root development only within that planting hole. During the course of that plant's life, we want to develop root tissue and root system outside of that immediate planting hole that we've provided. And the way to do that is by tilling in those amendments across a wide area around that tree or shrub at one time and then planting into those prepared beds. Now, I understand there's oftentimes scenarios in the landscape where we're replacing plants or we have an established planting area, and any amending that we do is going to be only in that hole that we dig. That's fine, but if it's possible, let's go ahead and prepare an entire area at one time. That's going to allow for more thorough amending, optimal root encouragement, water infiltration, and it prepares for other plants that you might add in the future. Do your diligence when you're looking at the areas that you're planting with your site assessment. Look at anything above ground, those utility lines, proximity to buildings or sight lines that you need to maintain good clearance for if you're planting along a roadside, for example. Think about that mature height and width of that plant before you put it in the landscape. That's going to be critical. In terms of the plant's health, it's also critical to maintain some distance from things in the landscape. For example, nursery industry standards say if you can plant 3 foot away from any kind of hardscaping or paving material, that's going to be best for that plant. That protects against heat damage and also allows for good root development. You'll also want to plant generally 15 foot away from buildings. That can address fire concerns, but can also address that full canopy height. We don't want that to be running up against a building and causing any kind of hazards there. 25 feet away from overhead utility wires, if possible, if the mature height of that plant is going to be above 30 feet. If that plant's finished height is going to be less than 30 feet, you can plant it under utility lines and that not be an issue. But I want you to think about that again at the time of planting. In terms of other things that we can do for site preparation below ground, you can always call 811 before you dig to determine those underground utilities that might be present in the area below ground. It's important to do a soil test, do some soil considerations. Soil tests are always helpful. Determine your soil nutrients and organic matter that's present, addressing any of those pH concerns by adding lime as recommended by that soil test. Factoring in that soil drainage or structure is also going to be important. So I hear questions asked a lot. What do you recommend just in general for fertilizer recommendations for my tree or shrub? Generally, what I'll say is it depends based on your site and the history of your site. To get the most clear picture, I recommend getting a soil test. The cost is minimal. This time of year, you may pay $4 for that soil sample. There's other times of the year where you're not going to pay anything. So take advantage of that. Those soil test kits are at your local extension office, and you're more than welcome to come by and we can discuss the results of that test and help you dial in your fertilization program. In terms of soil drainage and structure, one of the things that we can do is called a percolation test or a perk test. This is where you would dig a hole that you would set your plant in, fill it completely with water, come back once that water drains, fill it again, and then start the clock. Once you put that water in for the second time, note how long it takes to drain. If it's taking longer than 4 to 6 hours to drain, that's when we're going to see problems with your soil drainage. We can address that by adding more organic matter to your soil or by aerating the soil. That's a really important thing when planting trees and shrubs, to make sure that compaction is not an issue and that our roots have the ability to spread out and grow healthy. All right, let's talk about tools for the job. You're going to need a shovel. Sharp knives or scissors can be helpful, or a soil knife, which you can see pictured here on the top right. I like it because it has that serrated edge, and that can also help in terms of shaving off root tissue and addressing girdling roots. Pruning shears or hand shears can also be helpful. And if you are planting ball and burlap trees, wire cutters can also be helpful. Let's talk about types of plant material here. There's typically three types of plant material that are planted, and that's bare root, container plants, and balled and burlap. There are some things to keep in mind regardless of the type of plant material when we're planting. When we're digging the hole, we want that hole to be 2 to 3 times wider than the root ball that's measured at time of planting. Again, that's wider, not depth. You want to set the depth about equal to whatever that root ball is at the time of planting. If you plant below the height of that root ball, that can lead to that plant being planted too deep. There are problems associated with that, and we're going to discuss that in a moment. The height of that hole should be equal to the height of that root ball, or plant slightly above grade, and we'll talk about that later. You'll also want to look for the first main order root as a great way of determining that proper depth on the slide here. You can see what that first main order root looks like. In this diagram, you can see this is a taproot, oftentimes seen in Bareroot or container plants. If you were to wash away that media or that soil, this is often what a tree root system would look like. In this system, you have your main taproot, but then you also have these lateral branch roots. When we're talking about first main order roots, typically that's going to be your first main lateral branch of root coming off of that tree's trunk. That's going to be that first root that helps us determine that plant depth initially. We want that first lateral main order root to be covered in the soil by 2 to 3 inches. That really helps us set that planting depth. I'm going to first talk about ball and burlap trees. This is going to be our more sizable material. We talked about the importance of looking at the nursery and how it was planted initially to determine the quality of those plants. In this picture, this is at the field nursery. You'll notice there's a dark line in the middle of this picture. I'm circling with my mouse that dark line where that media was meeting that tree's trunk. And what you'll notice is the first main order root was actually down here at the bottom of that kind of dark transition zone on that bark. And that's where that plant should have been planted. So it was planted too deep. This bark can become rotted or compromised and can lead to that plant suffering some damage in the long run. So be sure you're looking at that from the outset. If it's planted too deep, I would ask for another plant because that can cause some problems down the road. When we take that plant home from the nursery, if it's field dug, oftentimes that's going to be wrapped in burlap, could potentially have a wire cage or twine. A lot of times we'll see nylon being used to secure that root ball around the trunk. You want to make sure you're removing all of that wrap before planting. I've heard a lot of times there's been some guidance in the past. If you remove the wire cage and all the twine, you can leave the burlap. That's just going to degrade over time. That's not really the case. Typically, if you leave that burlap on the bottom of those trees, it can lead to root girdling down the road and can oftentimes lead to not healthy establishment in terms of those roots growing outward like we want in a healthy tree or shrub. By removing all of those wraps at the time of planting, we can prevent problems down the road. Like you see in this picture at the bottom of the picture here, notice the foot showing that black nylon wrapping that's still present around the tree's roots and those first main order roots at the trunk. What that will cause is a girdling of that tree and can lead to compromise of that tree down the road. Make sure you're removing all that wrap, twine, and wiring at the time of planting. The second thing that you'll want to consider at time of planting for ball and burlap trees is pruning. At the time of planting, you'll want to prune off any of those dead branches, suckers, or maybe those crossing branches or those rubbing branches in the canopy. Go ahead and do that at the time of planting. Those things can cause issues down the road. By taking care of that, we can prevent larger pruning cuts or pruning wounds that tree would have to overcome later in its life. So go ahead and get that stuff out of the way. In terms of protecting that central leader, If you do have a leader that's somewhat codominant, meaning that we have a leader that we want to be our dominant leader, but we have a leader that's dangerously close to that, go ahead and prune out that other leader at time of planting. That can also be helpful and result in a smaller pruning wound that tree has to heal in the interim. Lower any of those temporary branches, those lower branches that we talked about, setting that canopy height at the right level. For our deciduous trees, that's about 2/3. For our evergreen trees, that's 3/4 of that tree height. Go ahead and remove those lower branches at time of planting is good practice. Then look for those girdling roots in the root ball and go ahead and address that. We'll talk about that too with some of the other planting types and the importance of that. Let's talk about digging the hole. Using your shovel handle or a measuring stick, we can determine the width and the height of that root ball at the time of planting, and that's what we're going to set our planting hole depth and width by. Dig the hole only as deep as the root ball. That's very important. We talked about the importance of the first main order root setting. Dig the hole 2 to 3 times wider than the root ball. That's going to encourage a lot of lateral root development and a healthy root system in general. You'll want to gently roll that plant into that planting hole once we get the height and width set. Importantly, when all is said and done and it's in the hole, we want the top of that root ball or that root structure, whether that be a container plant or a ball and burlap, we want that to be 1 to 2 inches slightly above that natural ground level of where we're planting. You may be asking yourself, Luke, why would I want to plant it slightly above the natural soil line in which I'm planting? And the answer to this, it allows for that natural settling to occur in that plant's life, especially once we water that plant. Oftentimes when we water that plant, it naturally settles over time. If we're planting at the outset, right at landscape level, oftentimes what happens is that natural settling will occur and we'll become below that landscape grade. That's an opportunity for water to pool near that trunk, which is not really what we want in terms of the long-term health of that plant. Planting it slightly above grade, we prevent those long-term issues. So planting, we want to backfill that planting hole. Once we have that hole dug, it's 2 to 3 times wider than the root ball. When we start moving that natural soil back into the hole that we just planted, as we're filling it in, fill it about halfway up, water in that soil, and then go ahead and add the rest of that soil back in. That's what's recommended in good practice. Adding organic matter around that planting hole, studies have shown that it really doesn't help you in the long run. It doesn't hurt you, but it doesn't help necessarily, because what we're doing by only adding organic matter in and around that root ball, we're just encouraging root development in that root ball. Now, if you're adding that organic matter in that hole that's 2 to 3 times the width, if we're digging the hole properly, you can add organic matter and that's fine. That's going to help you in the short term. But in the long run, adding organic matter outside of that planting hole that we've just dug, that's going to really encourage that tree's growth and development. So just be thinking about that. As you're adding that backfill back into the planting hole, you'll want to chop it in, meaning you don't want to add these big clumps of soil back into the root ball. That creates air pockets in and around that root ball that can lead to issues down the road with water penetration and compaction. By chopping in that soil to add in the backfill, we can prevent those issues from happening. You don't want to tamp the soil in really around ball and burlap plants. You want it to be secure and you want it to have good soil and root contact, but we don't want to stomp it to death. Okay. And a lot of times I work with landscapers and that's their natural inclinations. I'm going to really tamp it down and make sure that organic matter is touching all those roots, right? But what that can lead to is a lack of water infiltration and soil compaction down the roads. Minimal tamping. We want that tree to be secure in the hole. That's it. We don't really want to stomp it into the ground. By adding a berm to that hole, we can allow that water to accumulate near the root ball or the drip line, the edges of that root ball. We don't really want to direct water in next to the trunk. We'll show you some diagrams here. Again, we want to plant making sure that root ball is 1 to 2 inches above that landscape grade. So here's a diagram showing what I've just described. We have the top of the root ball. It's 10% or that 1 to 2 inches above landscape grade. We're covering that with a minimal layer of soil, and then we're having mulch put on top of that last part, covering the edge of that root ball, not piling on top of or near the trunk. Okay, we'll talk about that mulching later. You can see the backfill here. What do you notice? The hole is 2 to 3 times the width, but the height of the root ball is what we're setting the depth at. We don't want to dig the hole too deep, but we do want to dig the hole wider than that root ball, 2 to 3 times the width. Okay, so that's ball and burlap, but let's talk about some considerations for your bare root planting. Bare root planting, that's typically going to be fruit trees or things that you might order from a mail order nursery that's oftentimes sent in the fall of the year, where you would plant it in the dormant time of the year. You're going to want to move that tree again to the area of planting. It's important to keep the root system in a moist and cool environment. We're really only planting these bare root plants when the plants are dormant. If we plant it when the roots are active, that's where we can see a lot of damage and planting shock as a result of that. Keeping those bare root plants moist and healed is very important. In the picture on the right, at this mail order nursery, they are healing in the plants before they're shipped in the mail using mulch to cover those root systems and keep that area moist all the time. That's very important. Never let your bare root systems dry out in the middle of trying to get that tree planted, okay? So that's step one. Step two, pruning, with an emphasis here on bare root plantings. The central leader principles apply just like they did in ball and burlap. So the same rules apply there. But for root pruning in particular, you'll notice that I didn't really talk about root pruning for ball and burlap. Only girdling roots. There's not really an advantage there of pruning those roots in that ball and burlap because we're getting a much more comprehensive root system at the time of planting for a ball and burlap plant. But for bare root plants, it's important that we really are paying attention to those girdling roots. We want to make sure there's equal distribution of those roots on either side of the hole. We don't want all of the root mass curved to one side. We want that root mass to be equal, if possible, and spread out in that hole. You're going to dig that hole shallower than our container plantings or our ball and burlap plantings because there's less soil mass or media mass that's typically associated with bare root plants because we're only talking about the roots, right? There's nothing really attached to those roots. That's going to mean digging the hole shallower, but we also want to dig the hole wider for those bare root plants because we want to make sure that there's maximum infiltration and that they have a great start in terms of growing laterally. So that's going to be 3 to 4 times the root width for your bare root plants. It's okay to add some backfill into the planting hole if you dug it a little bit deeper than you intended to. Go ahead, add some of that backfill in and tamp that down as you're setting that bare root plant in the hole. Have a place or a mount where it can naturally sit and it's secure and it's not going to settle over time. If you don't tamp it down, it can naturally settle more. So tamping the ground at the bottom of that hole as you're planting for bare roots, we're talking about the area right under that main trunk, not in the whole bottom of the hole, but only in that mounted area where that trunk's going to make contact with the bottom of that hole. Tamp it down just in that area where that trunk is. That can allow it to sit in place and to not maneuver and be secure in that hole. You want to backfill first over those main order roots and those fibrous roots. Tamping the soil is more necessary in your bare root versus your container and ball and burlap, making sure that contact with the roots is made and those air gaps are minimized. You can do a little bit more tamping with your bare root plants versus your container and ball and burlap plants. So this is a good diagram talking about that support mound of soil right under the main trunk or the main leader. You can see this mound of soil at the bottom that's tamped that allows that planting depth to be set where we typically want that plant to be at 1 to 2 inches above that landscape grade. You can plant a little bit more even with your bare root plants by having this mound below that root system. You can see here the importance of having minimal mulch, that 2 inch of mulch across all of your lateral branches. Notice here that the planting hole is 3 to 4 times the width of this root ball, making sure that lateral development is what we're trying to encourage here. Lastly, let's talk about container plant considerations. Central leader pruning principles still apply. Watch out for root bound plants. That's in particular something that we need to think about when it comes to containers. You saw in one of the pictures showing the different planting types, how those roots can circle in the container and girdle themselves if we're not careful in a pot bound environment. We want there to be lots of roots in a container when we purchase a plant, but in the landscape, if we don't address those circling roots, it can lead to poor rooting structure in the future. So watch out for that. When we do that, shaving off 5 to 10% of the bottom and sides of the root material. Percentages are given here because sometimes with larger containers, you may need to shave off more around the edges and the sides and the bottom of those roots to encourage proper root development. If you don't see circling or girdling roots, it's okay to not necessarily cut or prune on those roots. We want to loosen simple teasing of those roots out if possible. That's what's really best to encourage those roots to start growing laterally and not stay in that contained form that they've been planted in. That's natural common sense there. Backfilling to 95% of that root ball height. What we're trying to aim for is 2 inches above that surrounding landscape grade. We've talked about that. Making sure that trunk flare is visible is very important at the time of planting. Be careful not to tamp because compaction can occur. Again, the width of that hole is 2 to 3 times the root ball width. So here's a great diagram that shows that. We have the root ball here planted a couple inches above that landscape grade. You can see here where the backfill is going to stop a couple inches above that root ball. Then we're going to come in with that organic matter on the top and that mulch layer. That 2 to 3 inches of mulch going to cover and lead to that final planting. We're going to talk about that in our tree establishment slides in a second. Are there any questions, Allison, on planting B&B plants, bare root, or containers?
On bare root plants, should you soak the bare roots before planting?
When you get your bare root plants from a mail order nursery, oftentimes they'll wrap that plant in a moist cloth or setting. There's also products that they use called Sure Gel that can keep those plants moist in transit. If you get that plant and it's dry, I would immediately stick it in water and let that plant soak. If that plant's wet and you're already prepared to plant, there's really no need or advantage to keep that plant soaking. If there's going to be any period of time, though, upon getting the plant and then planting it, you can keep it in a bucket of water, and that's a great solution. Or heal it in a pile of mulch or something. As long as you keep constant moisture on that plant, that's going to be critical. So to answer your question, it depends on when you're planting as to the importance of keeping it moist in that bucket of water, but making sure to keep it moist throughout is really important.
What about the depth of the graft union? When you're working with a grafted plant, where would you place that at planting?
It's going to depend on where they grafted it. I've worked with nurseries that graft their plant material. Typically, they will want to make that graft union 2 to 3 inches at the landscape grade, 2 to 3 inches above that. We want that graft union to be nowhere near that surface soil level if possible, because that's going to be a really good entry point for a lot of soil bacteria, microbes to start breaking down that trunk structure. Making sure that graft union is several inches above that finished landscape grade is really important.
Somebody had asked earlier about what if you dig a deeper hole than the root ball, but you refill it to the needed height? They thought that was important to break everything up a bit.
That's a great thought and suggestion. There's nothing wrong with that. If your soil is a natural mineral soil and it's not too compacted, you don't have to necessarily dig a whole lot deeper than that natural root ball height. But if your house is a recent construction, for example, oftentimes they'll bring in subsoil and pack in around that profile of that home. So you oftentimes have a lot of compaction there, and you may need to dig a little deeper to break that soil material up. It really does depend on your situation. in general, that's not really a necessity. The importance is we want to make sure that in that natural settling process that we're not going to have it be too deep. That's really important to prevent a lot of disease and pest issues that I get called out to are on plant material that was planted too deep.
What about deglazing the side of the hole? What is that about?
Oftentimes, when you're using a shovel blade to dig the sides of your hole, you'll see the sides of the hole become compacted or glazed. We talked about chopping your backfill as you're adding it back into the hole that you've created. Chopping from the sides of that hole is really important to make sure that soil is loosened and allows for that healthy lateral root movement that we want to see in a finished plant product. Let's talk about planting on slopes. A lot of us probably live in the mountains of Western North Carolina, and we do plant a lot on slopes. I get questions a lot on how do we set the depth and the width of a hole on the side of a hill that might be steep. We want to dig the hole depth so that the top of the root ball is even on the uphill side with that soil, if that makes sense. If this is our hill, we want to set the root ball where the top of that root ball is going to be even with that incline of that hill. The bottom of that root ball is going to be above the natural landscape grade. That's going to be sitting on top of the soil when I set that plant there. Around that depth of that hole, that area and that natural landscape grade, we want to break that up where we can get some infiltration there, but we're not going to dig any deeper. We're going to set that root ball there and we're going to add soil around the bottom of that root ball. We're going to have to bring soil and add onto the slope to cover that root ball and plant that thing properly. Bringing in enough soil to cover the sides of the root ball is our goal. Hopefully this picture makes it make more sense. You have your tree that you're planting here, and the lateral branching, that first main order root here that we're setting our plant depth at, that's going to be even with this top side of the slope here. You'll see the root ball that we're adding here is above grade, pretty substantially above grade. What we're going to want to do is add that soil back around the sides of that root ball, peeling it in from the lower side and to plant it in a way where we're not going to see over time as that plant settles and erosion and natural things happen over the course of that plant's life. If we plant it into that slope too deep, oftentimes that soil will naturally move over the course of that plant's life and pile up on top of that trunk or around the base of that trunk, effectively burying it. We want to prevent that by planting it above that landscape grade when it comes to slopes. Now, anything above a 30% slope will require terracing. You may think to yourself, Luke, how do I know what the percentage of my slope is? If you remember in high school math, when we are determining the slope, it's rise over run. If you have a 2-to-1 slope, that's going to be 2 over rise over 1 run to determine your slope. So when I say percentage, that's a 30% slope is a rise of 3 over 1, if that makes sense. So anything above a 30% slope gradient will require terracing to prevent what I was discussing earlier of soil backfilling over time against a tree's trunk. This picture on the bottom left, if you can see my cursor here, I'm circling where that first main order root is naturally occurring on this tree's trunk. You'll see this is a natural root flare here of this tree. What has happened, though, is that soil has over time washed down that slope and it's buried the bottom of this trunk, which can lead to a compromise of the integrity of that trunk over time. You could see that tree snap or decay prematurely. Erosion, water movement can compromise the integrity of that trunk. By terracing, like you'll see in this picture, you can plant trees and shrubs on a slope that's steeper than a 30% grade. That's going to mean that we're going to have to do some terracing. That's going to prevent that erosion from water and other things and natural settling over time from compromising the integrity of that trunk. Let's talk about tree establishment. Okay, so you've planted your tree appropriately, and now how do we get that tree established and off on the right foot? We've talked about mulching, and what I see a lot of times is this natural inclination to pile Organic matter is good, and I'm going to pile it close to that tree so that tree can benefit from it. But we don't want to mound that mulch up around the base of that tree. We call this volcanic or volcano mulching. We don't want to see that. That's going to lead to a sad tree. We want happy trees planted with the mulch pulled away from that root flare on the base of that tree, and we want minimal mulch right around the trunk of that tree. We don't want any mulch contacting the trunk of that tree if possible. Ideal depth of mulch should only be 2 to 3 inches. The functionality of mulch, for those that wonder why we even mulch in the first place, it's to keep moisture near the feeder roots, those roots that take in nutrients and water. Where you see a lot of those feeder roots is at the drip line of trees. So oftentimes I see mulch like a donut right around the tree's base and not where those roots are actively growing, which is at the drip line of those trees. You can see here, this is the drip line of this tree. Ideally, we want to mulch to the drip line of that tree. And yeah, that may mean that there's going to be less turf around the area of that tree, but by mulching to the drip line, that's going to lead to moisture being captured and held where we want it to be. It also minimizes compaction in the critical zone of root development, which is around that drip line. If we can mulch a little bit more out from the center of that tree, I know that's going to mean less lawn, but that's going to lead to longevity of that tree if you can mulch to the drip line. Is it the end of the world if you don't mulch to the drip line? Not necessarily, but we mulch for weed suppression, moisture retention, and temperature control of that root zone. When we do mulching wrong, though, and you can see that in the picture on the left, like volcano mulching, oftentimes the end result is the picture on the top right. You'll see trees snap off at the base over time because that organic matter is just sitting on the trunk of that tree. Nature's going to win out over time, and that decomposition is going to happen as a result of it being literally buried below that landscape grade. Trees are not designed to be planted like this. That's what can happen as a result of volcano mulching. Another thing that can result by piling up mulch like this is the formation of what I call adventitious roots. And those are roots that are formed along the trunk that should not be formed from the trunk structure. It's basically a plant's response to being planted too deep. Those are weak roots oftentimes. This is a tree that was planted too deep and also had mulch similar to this. When they pulled the mulch back from that tree, this is what they saw. These are adventitious roots forming at the base of that tree. What's going to happen over time, and you can see it already happening, these roots are crossing each other along that tree's base, girdling that tree's base, and that compromises that integrity over time. We really can prevent that by mulching at the right depth. Tree staking. I get questions about this all the time. Should I stake my tree? Should I not? Generally, it's not required to stake your tree if your soil texture is where it needs to be. Maybe some of your sandier, loamier soils that are naturally a little bit more unstable or less compact, you may need to plant or stake initially, especially for larger trees where the canopy might sway that tree over time. You can stake in those situations. There's 3 primary reasons why we stake our trees. That's to protect the root system during establishment, and only during establishment. To support that tree, because the tree canopy, once it's leafed out, can be heavy. And it's to anchor those bare root or container plantings in that hole that we just planted it in. We don't want the whole root system that we just buried to come unearthed because of a wind or storm event that can knock that tree around before it gets a chance to really set those roots in that hole. Generally, it's not a recommended practice if the hole is planted properly. If it's done improperly, there can be more damage done by staking the tree versus unstaking it. I'll show you what that good staking looks like. The need can depend on wind conditions around you. If you're in a more windy spot, maybe staking is more of a requirement for you than someone else. Slope can also change staking requirements or the benefit of staking. If you're planting on a steep slope, oftentimes slope staking is necessary to make sure that tree our plant's not going to shift downhill over time. We talked about sandier or loamier soils can be a little bit more unstable at the bottom or at the base of that tree or shrub, so staking might be more necessary there. So proper staking, typically nylon straps are used. You want 3 stakes and you want to triangulate those nylon straps just to the exterior rim of that root ball that's being planted. We don't want to set those stakes way outside of the exterior rim of where we've just set those plants. We want those stakes to be just outside of that root ball. Stakes should be at least 1 foot in length, and the straps shouldn't be too tight. When we stick our stakes into the ground and we have the nylon straps that are wrapped around the trunk of our tree, we don't want the tautness of that strap to be so tight that there's no ability for that tree trunk to move naturally in the wind. We want that natural movement to happen in the wind because that strengthens the overall root system and the integrity of that tree over time. If you have it too taut, that tree's not going to develop good, strong roots to prevent that natural unease or movement to occur. Here's 2 pictures. One is good staking and one is bad staking. On the left, we have a triangulated system with those nylon straps around that tree. It's not too taut. On the picture on the right, what do you notice? There's only 1 stake and it's right up against that tree's trunk. That's not going to be a good recipe for that tree in the long run. That's going to lead to a weak tree. As that tree grows and it's already come in contact with that tree stake, it could girdle the tree and lead to longer term health effects that we don't want to see. Pruning is another thing that's important to talk about. When pruning at the time of planting, and really just any time you're pruning, never prune more than 1/3 of that canopy structure. If you do, that's going to risk that plant going into shock. I talked about the importance of pruning out those crossing or rubbing branches and the codominant leader and central leader formed trees. That's all fine and good as long as we follow that 3rd rule of pruning. When we prune, we want to prune properly. We want to leave that branch collar in place. The branch collar is that part of the plant where we have cells that can heal those wounds over time. If you cut into that branch collar, it's not going to be able to heal effectively. So you want to not prune too deep into that tree. You want to leave that branch collar intact. Try to purchase plants that don't require substantial pruning. I talked about things that we want to prune out of the tree, dead branches, codominant leader, rubbing or crossing branches. If you can pick a tree that doesn't have those at the time of planting, that's obviously going to be better. Pruning at time of planting, to summarize this, dead material, crossing or rubbing branches, suckers, girdling roots, codominant leaders, that's going to be at the time of planting. Those crowded branches in the canopy, low branches, narrow angle branch attachment, that's something that can wait until later. When you're thinking about the importance of pruning, focus on those needed things first and leave the rest of that structural pruning at a later date. Irrigation. It's important to water thoroughly at the time of planting, but don't overwater. Backfill the hole halfway to provide that security at the time of planting. Water, wait for a period of time, and water again, making sure that we're allowing that water to infiltrate and we're not pouring too much water in where it's sloshing around and that tree's not able to set itself correctly. Rule of thumb generally for irrigating at the time of planting, 3 to 4 gallons of water per caliper inch. That's a pretty good bit of water that you're going to put on that plant at the time of planting and during the establishment period, which we're going to talk about on the next slide. Soil texture and drainage can also change this. If you're planting in a sandier soil or a loamier soil, more water might need to be added. Irrigation scheduling, we have an establishment period. The time it takes for that tree to get really established and set in place can be anywhere from 6 months to a year, typically. The first 1 to 2 months of that establishment period, it's important to provide water every 2 to 3 days if there is no water naturally being supplied to that plant. 2 to 3 gallons per inch of caliper daily is best. After 2 months of that plant being in the ground, weekly irrigation is what we're talking about. It's important to note that the frequency and the duration of your irrigation matters. It's best when watering plants, whether it be your turf or your trees and shrubs, to water deeply at one time and infrequently. Oftentimes, irrigation scheduling can be set for watering shallower or smaller amounts multiple times a day. That's not really a good recipe. We want to water deeply and more infrequently. That's generally your rule of thumb. Irrigation needs are going to change again based on that soil type, the size of the plant that we're putting in place, the plant material itself. Some plant material needs more water than others. In the cooler or more dormant times of the year, that tree is going to require less water because we're going to see less active root development and canopy development happening at the same time. So seasonality also is a factor there. Where do you want to water your tree? You want to water where those active root zones are going to be, and those are going to be in the drip line of that tree. If we can, we're going to mulch to the drip line. If we're going to be irrigating, we want to irrigate around the drip line where those active roots are growing, not around the base of that tree. Because while these tree roots can absorb water, the majority of that water is going to be absorbed around that tree canopy line. There's several irrigation systems that I've seen put in place around the time of planting. These water bags can be put in place. Almost looks like a donut where you would fill the water in this bag. There's holes in the bottom of this bag that allow for that water to penetrate over time and allow that root zone to not dry out after immediately planting. So tree water bags can be a solution, or you can put drip line or drip tape in place. Importantly, we want that drip line to be put in place where those active feeder roots are going to be. Spray stakes is something else that you can use. Irrigation systems can look differently depending on what you'd like to put in. Fertilization at the time of planting is not particularly necessary. Remember how I talked about preparation of beds or holes before we even start planting based on soil testing and soil reports? Those amendments should be made before planting, ideally a couple months before, to allow for that fertilization and any kind of pH adjustments. Doing all of that before the time of planting is going to be best. If we add fertilizer and other things into the hole, we risk more injury than good, because what can happen is burn occurring from adding too much fertilizer in that root area. Those root tissues are naturally more sensitive at the time of planting because we've just pruned those roots. We've just pulled it out of the ground. If it was field dug, they're a lot more sensitive to salt burn that can accumulate as a result of adding fertilizer into the hole. So if applied after planting, go ahead and wait a couple months to a year before applying any fertilizer if needed. That's a good rule of thumb. Here's what a soil test report looks like. If you haven't done a soil test report, if you come to either me or Allison to ask about this, we're going to say, hey, think about doing a soil test report. That's going to tell us exactly what we're looking at and what's needed. And it's also going to tell us our pH range of where that needs to be. Here's some good resources to have. The Extension Gardener Handbook, Woody Ornamentals, Chapter 11 is a good resource. We also have the NC State Extension Gardening Portal as it relates to tree care. I love this North Carolina Urban Forest Council Tree Owners Manual. This is a really good guide. It's about 10 to 12 pages for tree owners on guidance on how to plant and how to establish that plant effectively. Treesaregood.org is another great resource if you're interested in finding a qualified arborist near you that's certified and insured. Basic tree care information is also going to be included at treesaregood.org. If you're interested in learning more about gardening on slopes and hillsides, there's a great publication that just recently came out from Iowa State Extension Service on how to plant and garden slopes and hillsides. So with that, if there are any questions, I'll take those, and hopefully you got something out of the talk today.
Luke, thank you so much. It helps to really think about, because sometimes we're not planting our own trees. We're hiring somebody to do this. And it's important for us to have this information so that we know that they're doing it right. And they're following some standards, or should be. We do have a couple of questions. One was young trees were damaged on the trunk by landscapers with their weed eaters. The trunks have healed over, but will they ultimately be okay?
Yeah, Trees are very resilient. One of the more resilient plants that we can put in the landscape. So if there is mechanical damage, say from a weed eater, or you brought the plant home from the nursery and you're like, shoot, I didn't realize that there's something going on the trunk. Trees have a natural ability to heal over those wounds. It depends on the size and the extent of that damage. If it girdles that tree trunk, that's when you're going to start seeing damage. But if it's not girdling that tree, meaning encompassing the whole circumference of that tree, it should have the ability to heal itself.
Okay, something to watch. Somebody just planted a tree that isn't quite vertical. Can that be corrected with staking?
It depends on how long the tree has been planted. If it's been planted for longer than a couple months, if you tried to stake it now, you could be doing more damage than good. If it's been less than a couple months, you can go ahead and try to do that, but you don't want it to be too taut. I would be hesitant to do that, honestly, because trees can correct for that by straightening out over time. You may have a slight inclination or a slight grade difference, but it will naturally correct over time and you should be fine.
Somebody said they have mature maples that were planted with a thick mat and they have some adventitious roots, but the trees are mature and healthy. Does anything need to happen around that?
If the mats are around the base of that trunk, if you can pull out those mats from that immediate area where the trunk is, that's going to be good, I think, and would prevent further adventitious roots from occurring. If that tree is already established, I think you're going to be okay. Adventitious roots can happen over time, especially in a naturalized or wooded area. You'll see that a lot in leaf litter and that sort of thing. That area immediately around that trunk, if you can pull it out and prevent that contact there, that's going to be best.
I'm always grateful for you, Luke. It was important to cover a lot of this information, so it was really good. Join us on the 21st of August for Gardening in the Mountains Myth of the Climate Haven. This is a talk by Drake Fowler, the executive director at the North Carolina Arboretum. Have a great day and enjoy the garden. Stay hydrated and stay cool. Thank you.